Sveiki, aš Goda ir čia radikalus smalsumas. Skiepai yra vienas efektyviausių būdų apsisaugoti nuo pavojingų ir net mirtinų ligų. Jie padeda mūsų imuniniai sistemai atpažinti ir įveikti įvairius virusus ir bakterijas. Deja, dėl informacijos trūkumo ir nesusikalbėjimo visame pasaulyje aktyvėja antivakcinacijos judėjimas, dėl kurios skleidžiamos propagandos suserga ir miršta vaikai. Lietuva yra neišimtis. Apie tai, kaip veikia skiepai, kokie yra paplitę pavojingi mitai, pasikalbėjau su infekcinių ligų, imunologijos ir virologijos profesoriumi, vienu garsiausių pasaulyje skiepų veikimo komunikatorių, roto skiepo kūrėjų ir daugybės mokslinių straipsnių ir knygų autoriumi Polu Offitu. Are vaccines safe?
Yes, using the medical definition of safety, which is to say that the benefits of a vaccine have to clearly and definitively be greater than the risks of the people who are getting them. So yes, vaccines are safe. They're not absolutely safe, which is to say they do have side effects. They can have pain or redness or tenderness at the site of injection. Some vaccines can have more serious side effects, but on balance, the benefits of vaccines clearly and definitively outweigh their risks.
What would be your advice to those who are still in doubt if they should vaccinate their kids?
Well, they should do what we do with our kids, which is to give them the vaccines that can protect them. I think it's reasonable to be skeptical of anything that you put into your body or anything that you put into your child's body, including vaccines. I think it's fair to ask questions. So people ask questions. They say, for example, my child got a vaccine and now something's happened to them. They have, diabetes, or they have autism, or they have hypertension, or they have attention deficit disorder, or whatever. Could the vaccine have done that? That's a fair question to ask. And so invariably there are studies done showing that vaccines don't cause a lot of the problems that people fear. And I think when they then see those studies, or at least are told about those studies, they should believe them. Because I think, doctors and scientists are trying to address parents' concerns by doing the kinds of studies that basically they're asking for.
Does giving several vaccines at once can cause any damage to a child, like, overwhelm their immunity or something like that?
Right. So when you're in the womb, before you're born, you're in a sterile environment. When you enter the birth canal and the world, you're not. And very quickly you have living on the surface of your body trillions of bacteria. I mean, typically a human will have about 100 trillion bacteria that live on the surface of your body. And you have bacteria that line your nose and your throat and your intestines. You make an immune response to those bacteria. You do. Your body responds to those bacteria to make sure that they stay on the surface and don't invade into your bloodstream. Each single bacterium has between 2,000 and 6,000 immunological components. And by immunological component, what I mean is bacterial protein or the complex sugar, so-called polysaccharide, that sits on the surface of the bacteria. You make grams of immunoglobulin, antibodies, to make sure that those bacteria stay at your surface. The total number of immunological components in vaccines, by which I mean viral protein, bacterial protein, or that bacterial complex sugar that sits on the surface of bacteria, is maybe 150 to 160. So think about it. You have trillions of bacteria that live on the surface of your body, to which you make an immune response. Each bacterium has between 2,000 and 6,000 immunological components. The total number of immunological components in the vaccines that you get in the first few years of life is only about 150, not 150,000. Just 150. I think a cut knee is a greater chance to your immune system than vaccines. I think a single common cold infection is a greater chance to your immune system than vaccines. So no, vaccines don't weaken or overwhelm or perturb or damage the immune system. No.
What if a child has some pre-existing condition? Can that do any damage in any way?
Well, so if a child, for example, is born without an immune system, so-called severe combined immune deficiency disease, that child can't respond to vaccines very well. So that child, isn't going to benefit from vaccines and may be hurt by them. If a child is getting chemotherapy for their cancer, or a child is getting the biologicals for a chronic disease, or some children are too young to get vaccines. I think, in those situations, obviously you aren't going to be giving certain vaccines, but for the most part, that's it. Really, it's really people who are born without functional immune systems, who have acquired dysfunctional immune systems because they're getting cancer chemotherapy or biological agents that are directed against their immune system. Those are really the only groups that you really have to worry about. So, I think the answer is only those conditions really do you need to worry.
Mm-hmm. Are there any toxins or other harmful materials in vaccines?
Not at the level contained in vaccines, no. So, for example, mercury can be used as a preservative in some multi-dose vials of vaccines, but the quantity of mercury in there is trivial. You're exposed to far more mercury, assuming you live on the planet Earth every day, than you're ever going to be exposed to mercury from a vaccine. The same thing's true of aluminum. The same thing's true of a number of agents in vaccines. I mean, vaccines are biological agents. Therefore, they're made in cells and all the growth factors that cells require. So there are some agents that at very high levels, can be toxic, but not nearly at the levels contained in vaccines. I mean, if I drank 2 gallons of water immediately, that would lower the capacity of my body to hold on to sodium. And that would lower the level of sodium in my bloodstream so that I can have a seizure. That doesn't mean that water is toxic. It just means I shouldn't drink 2 gallons at one time. The same thing's true here. I mean, the old saying is that the dose makes the poison. In this case, the doses are so low as to not be poisonous. I mean, assuming you live on the planet Earth, you're going to have a variety of heavy metals in your bloodstream: cadmium, thallium, beryllium, arsenic, mercury, at levels far lower than can do harm. If we had the notion that any level is inadequate, then we should move to another planet, because on this planet there's going to be a variety of agents that at high levels can hurt us, but at low levels don't.
How are the vaccines tested before they become publicly available?
Right. So in order to get your vaccine licensed, at least in this country by the Food and Drug Administration, or in Europe by the EMEA, they need to go through extensive testing. So I was involved with one vaccine, which was the rotavirus vaccine here in the United States at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And, you do initial animal model testing. Then you do small tests to make sure that the vaccine is safe. Then you do larger tests to make sure the vaccine is safe in people. And then you do tests to make sure that it induces an adequate immune response. And that takes time. And, it involves, tens of thousands of experimental animals. Often it involves, hundreds and thousands of people, eventually children, to make sure that it's safe, to make sure that it's effective. And then you do the big so-called phase 3 clinical trial to make sure that the vaccine works in a natural setting. Those are usually trials of 60,000, 70,000 people. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and usually the time it takes to make a vaccine is 25 years, 20 to 25 years. So these vaccines are extensively tested.
Some say that vaccine-preventable diseases are just a part of our childhood. So is natural immunity in any way better than vaccine-acquired immunity?
Yes, it is. Natural immunity is better in that it induces a generally higher titered and longer-lived immunity. But, take measles. The problem with getting natural immunity is, one, you might die from the natural infection or suffer severe or permanent harm from the natural infection. The goal of a vaccine is to induce immunity that's good enough. And that can induce essentially protection without having to pay the price of natural infection. So measles is a good example. I am a child of the 50s. I had the 1950s. I had measles. I had mumps. I had German measles. I had chickenpox. I had all those diseases. So the titers that I have of measles in my bloodstream, the quantity of antibodies that I have of measles against measles in my bloodstream is probably 3 times higher than someone who has been vaccinated. But the fact of the matter is, we eliminated measles from the United States by the year 2000 with a measles vaccine. So the better question is vaccination good enough? Yes, it's good enough. I was fortunate. I wasn't one of those 48,000 people in this country that was hospitalized with measles every year. I wasn't one of the 500 children who died every year from measles. I was lucky, but many people weren't.
Before this interview, I was reading parents' groups and their discussions, and some parents claim that their kids developed some kind of allergies after they got the shots. Is that possible?
Right, so that's been looked at. I mean, there's no evidence that vaccines induce allergic responses. I mean, they induce long-term allergies. I mean, sometimes people can get a vaccine that is stabilized with gelatin, which can cause an allergic response, but it doesn't cause a long-term allergic response. It really happens within the first 15 minutes, and it can be stopped by a shot of epinephrine. And that's rare. It occurs in about 1 per 1.4 million doses, but it doesn't induce long-term allergic problems like asthma or hay fever or other allergies. It doesn't. Vaccines don't do that, no.
What was the most surprising vaccine myth that you heard from the anti-vaxxers movement?
Okay, that's a good question, and I definitely have the answer to that one. A few months ago, I was called by a student who said, "Isn't it true that some vaccines are made using human fetal cells?" Yes, that is true.
Yeah, that's also a myth in Lithuania.
No, but it is true. I mean, the varicella or chickenpox vaccine, the rubella vaccine or German measles vaccine, one of the rabies vaccines, the hepatitis A vaccine, there were 2 elective abortions that were performed in the early 1960s that produced 2 cell lines. One was called WI38, the other was called MRC5, that were used to make and are used to make those 4 vaccines. But those same cells from the early 1960s are still used today. So that is true. I mean, it is true that human fetal fragments of human fetal DNA are contained in those vaccines. So the question was, if that's true, and it's true that those elective abortions were performed in a child who would have eventually been a boy or girl, isn't it then possible that the genetic fragments can insert themselves into the child's DNA and cause the child to be transgender? That was the question.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, which myths regarding the vaccines are the most dangerous?
Well, the fact that the notion that vaccines cause autism, I think, is the most dangerous because for a lot of reasons. One, it's not true. Study after study has shown that vaccines don't cause autism. 2, I think that it scared parents about getting vaccines because autism is emotionally burdensome. It's financially burdensome. No one, wants to sign up for that. And so people think they can avoid autism by avoiding vaccines, which isn't true. And it's also diverted a lot of resources away from children who could certainly benefit from support services rather than doing yet another study to show that vaccines don't cause autism. There's this sort of fruitless dead-end hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Wakefield's study, which was denied, is still used by the anti-vaxxers to base their claims that vaccines cause autism. Could you break down the study to the Lithuanian audience and explain why it was false?
Well, first of all, it wasn't a study. Nothing was studied. It was just a case series, meaning it was 12 children who had developmental delays, 8 of whom had autism within a month, supposedly within a month of receiving the vaccine. The Wakefield proposed that because the combination measles, mumps, rubella vaccine or German measles vaccine was given in combination, that caused the immune system to be blunted or lessened. That because the immune system was blunted, that allowed measles vaccine virus to travel to the intestine and damage intestinal cells, which then allowed the entrance of brain-damaging proteins to enter the bloodstream, cross an intact blood-brain barrier and cause autism. Now, he didn't have any information for any of this. He didn't show that the immune system was blunted. He didn't show that there was measles vaccine virus in intestinal cells. He didn't show that there was any protein that was brain-damaging that entered the circulation. He had no evidence for any of that. Worse, some of those children, even though he said all the children developed symptoms within 14 days of getting the vaccine, some of the children developed those symptoms before they ever got the vaccine, and some of them developed those symptoms months later. So he misrepresented data. He misrepresented clinical data. He misrepresented biological data. He misrepresented data showing that presumably the intestines were inflamed when they weren't. So he misrepresented all those data. And for that reason, that paper was retracted. So technically, it doesn't exist. So if anti-vaccine activists point to that paper, they should know that it no longer exists. It's been retracted because it was so full of holes. The other thing is, unknown to Wakefield's co-investigators, he had received hundreds of thousands of dollars to essentially launder legal claims through a medical journal, which his co-authors didn't know about it. And he developed a sort of say, quote unquote, safer measles vaccine, which he had patented, was hoping to make money off of. He was a scoundrel. Andrew Wakefield was a scoundrel.
What global trends of vaccines or vaccine-related movements have you noticed lately?
In general, things are getting better. I think that the anti-vaccine activists have largely lost their voice. In the United States, mainstream media really doesn't pay attention to them anymore. Their platform is really social media. That's where they have a voice, but otherwise they've lost their voice elsewhere. But they have had an impact. I mean, the number of children, for example, who had died from measles had decreased dramatically over the last 10 years, but in the last couple of years, it's increased again. We eliminated measles from the United States in 2000, but last year we had 1,300 cases of measles because a critical number of parents had chosen not to vaccinate their children. So they've had an effect. They've been able to hurt a lot of children in this country and in this world, and for that they should be ashamed.
Anti-vaccine movements usually have the leaders and they are very influential, and the same happens in Lithuania. People somehow listen to them, although they are incompetent on commenting anything that's vaccine related. Should we talk to these people? Should we try and get into a dialogue with them somehow, or should we just focus on the followers, on the parents?
Yeah, I think the key things are trying to figure out what, for example, in Lithuania are the contentions. Are they contending that vaccines cause autism or diabetes or multiple sclerosis, or what specific, or that they contain harmful ingredients? And if that's true, you try and provide the information to the parents who are influenced by this to show that those are false concerns, and that they've been, that the scientific studies have exonerated those concerns, or lessened those concerns, or eliminated those concerns. So I think you focus on the parents. You're never going to. First of all, you're never going to convince the anti-vaccine activists that they're wrong. They're conspiracy theorists. They just believe the government is lying to them, that pharmaceutical companies are buying the government, or buying the medical establishment. So you're never going to convince them. I think the trick is to try and convince the people who are influenced by them.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed lately that the anti-vaxxers have this new strategy. Instead of claiming that the vaccines don't work, that they are against vaccines, they say we are for 100% safe vaccines. Isn't this claim false? What is your opinion?
Well, nothing is 100% safe. I mean, take a shower in the morning, you could fall and hurt yourself. Walk outside on a rainy day, you could be struck by lightning. If you get in your car, you could have a car accident. So nothing is 100% safe. Any medical procedure that has a benefit can potentially have a negative effect. That's always true. That's never going to not be true. So I think they're not for vaccine safety, because when they bring up vaccine safety issues like vaccines cause autism, when study after study shows that that's not true, when they say they want a safe vaccine, they mean they want vaccines, for example, that don't cause autism. Well, they've got those vaccines. They want vaccines that don't cause diabetes or learning disorders or hyperactivity or attention deficit disorder. They have those vaccines. So they never talk about real vaccine safety issues. They're just anti-vaccine activists. They have nothing to do with vaccine safety. I mean, I was on the so-called Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices at the CDC in the late 90s and early 2000s, and there was a man whose son had been paralyzed by the oral polio vaccine. In other words, the oral polio vaccine every year in the United States would cause about 8 children to be paralyzed by the vaccine. He thought that's not reasonable. I mean, why give this oral vaccine, this oral polio vaccine? Why not give the inactivated vaccine, give the shot instead of the squirt in the mouth? Because that shot doesn't cause this. And we eventually did that. We eventually, in the 2 years that he was advocating for this, we eventually moved away from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated vaccine, because that really was a vaccine safety issue. He was a vaccine safety activist. He was. But most people who call themselves vaccine safety activists are just anti-vaccine because they don't believe the data, no matter how clear and compelling and convincible and reproducible it is. They never believe the data because they're conspiracy theorists.
You are one of the inventors of the rotavirus vaccine, and the anti-vaxxers, they use this claim against you, and they say that you are biased. What do you say to them? Because I believe that after this interview, we would hear the same claims here in Lithuania.
So I chose to go into medicine because I cared about people. I chose to go into pediatrics because of the love of children. I chose to work on rotavirus because rotavirus, prior to the vaccine, in the United States would cause 75,000 hospitalizations and 60 deaths every year in our country. And in the world, this virus killed about 500,000 people a year, as many as 2,000 children a day. I'm fortunate enough to have an interest in science and a love of science that enabled me to figure out how we could make a vaccine to prevent this disease. It's the professional accomplishment of which I am most proud. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team here at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that created the strains that became this vaccine, Rototec, that has the capacity to save hundreds of lives a day. The motivation for doing that and the reward from doing that were never financial. So if people don't believe that, I don't care. I mean, I know why I did what I did. I know the reward for doing what I did. And in no sense was it ever financial. So, I mean, anti-vaccine people, because they don't have the facts on their side, they attack the people who present the facts that argue against them because they don't have the facts on their side. If they had the facts on their side, we'd be hearing the facts. If you don't have the facts on your side, what do? You shoot the messenger. So that's what they're doing. If they knew me, they would know that never in my life have I ever been driven by solely financial desire. I mean, if I did that, why would I have ever gone into science? I mean, science isn't exactly a way to make money.
Because of your work, you not only received hate mail or hateful comments, but also death threats. What triggers people the most? Why would they threaten your life because of something that you said?
Because they're awful people. I mean, what can I say? They think that their children were hurt. They think that somehow I hurt them. I'm not sure why they think that. I mean, all I do is stand up for science. The reason I stand up for science is I don't like it that children getting hurt by this. I mean, who's really getting hurt by all this bad information about vaccines? I mean, what happens is anti-vaccine activists put out bad information about vaccines that cause some people, even reasonable people, to choose not to vaccinate their children, and then the children suffer and occasionally are hospitalized and rarely die from vaccine-preventable diseases. It's the children who suffer our ignorance, and it's the children that I stand up for. I mean, if I'm so wealthy, if I'm just, we made this vaccine, was licensed, 13 years ago, it was 14 years ago, in 2006. Why am I still standing up? Why shouldn't I just retire and live off my great, vast wealth, as they're arguing? Why do I still stand up for these children, kids, considering especially that I get hate mail and I get occasionally physically harassed and I get death threats? I do it because of a love for children. I do it because I'm sick and tired of watching children come into our hospital, suffer or be hospitalized and die because their parents made an uninformed and frankly ignorant choice. I can't stand that. Medicine's hard enough as it is. But what we do know is that vaccines are safe and effective. And when parents choose not to do that and put their children in harm's way, it's unconscionable. Invariably, it's the children who suffer our ignorance. That's always true, and that's how I see myself. I see myself as standing up for children. So I'm willing to take the hits that invariably come with doing that.
Last year, Lithuania had the most measles cases in 30 years. This directly correlates to the number of unvaccinated children. What measurements should our public officials, in your opinion, take now to stop this?
They should mandate vaccines. They should say that you can't come to school, including private school, unless you've been vaccinated. I think that if enough parents are making this uninformed choice that puts not only their own children, but children with whom they come in contact at risk, then it's time to stand up for the children of Lithuania. I think that it's invariably assumed that parents will always make the best choice for their children, that parents will always make the safest choice for their children. But that's not always true. And when it's not true, then who stands up for those children? If not, in this case, the government. I think the government should stand up and say that they are not going to allow parents to make a decision that harms their children or harms those with whom they come in contact. And remember, not everyone can be vaccinated. I mean, in our country of 300 plus million people, there are about 500,000 children who can't be vaccinated because they're getting chemotherapy for their cancers or they're getting biological agents for their chronic diseases. They depend on those around them to protect them. And when herd immunity or community immunity erodes, they're invariably the ones that suffer. Who stands up for them? Who looks out for them, if not the government? So I think that the government at some point needs to stand up for the children and say it's not okay for parents to put their children in harm's way. That's not their inalienable right to allow their child to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection.
Paul, thank you for explaining vaccines to the Lithuanian audience.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Ačiū, kad žiūrėjote. Likite su Delfi televizija.